Let's now speak to Professor Tom Ojienda. He worked very closely with the late Ambassador Bethuel Kiplagat. Sir, not a very good morning, especially for those who knew the late Ambassador. What are your reflections looking back at his life? What kind of a person was he?
I would say that Ambassador Kiplagat was a focused person, a diplomat par excellence, and an individual who was able to weather the storm of conflict and brought people together at all times. The best that I learned of him, and I remember one of the lessons that Ambassador passed to me, was to ensure that you embrace all at all times. He worked with us. We worked for over 3 years at the Truth Commission, from September 2009 to June 2013. And we traveled around the country together. And I recall that even in the times of conflict within the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission itself, Ambassador was always a negotiator. He was always open to criticism. And even when you criticized him, he always took it and appreciated where a person was coming from. And those are some of the strengths of a diplomat. I would describe Ambassador as a diplomat par excellence. I think the country will miss him.
Right. You worked alongside him in the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. Talk to me about the experiences you went through and his role in that entire process.
He was the chair of the Truth Commission. Of course, there was a bit of conflict within the workings of the TJRC, and as you have rightly pointed out, some of the concerns within the human rights movement at the time that he was in government at the time that the Wagala massacre occurred. But as I've said, we were able to deal with the questions even amid the conflict. We covered ground, and in the end, we produced a 6-volume report, of course, which remains unimplemented to date. But as you may have learned, the report of the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission has a number of strong sides, which were not, of course, there has been no implementation of the report, but the report has produced by the TJRC has very important recommendations, especially to victims of human rights violations over the period since the independence of this country. So I must say that a lot was gained or achieved by the TJRC in spite of the internal wrangles that we had at inception and in the course of our work.
The TJRC report has not been implemented as yet, and we've had several leaders talking about it, Professor. From where you sit, what difference will it make if the report is implemented? What does the country stand to gain?
I think that there are a number of recommendations that are key, especially key recommendations that stand out and that were meant to be steered by Parliament. Include recommendations, for instance, on the land question, recommendations that touch on victims of torture and various human rights abuses, compensation, and the sense of the report is that it will bring the country to reconcile with itself and to also ensure that those who suffered are not just left to suffer. We need, for instance, to have decent burials for victims of the Mount Elgon massacre, for instance. We need to appease certain paining of sections of the population that seem left out. We are happy that some people in this country who were previously regarded as aliens are now citizens. There are a number of recommendations that we made that, for instance, touch on the land question that would make a difference even in the way politics in this country is run, so that the TJRC report, if only understood by Kenyans, is a very, very important report. It would heal some of the pains that we see politicians talk about. I'm sure there would be a thing of the past if some of these the recommendations of the report were implemented. As I've said, Ambassador Kiplagat went through the process. he participated in the final report. He was at the forefront when we handed the report with Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta. And indeed, government departments have implemented certain sections of the report without saying they're implementing it.
Like you say, he went through the process. He was part of the team that drafted the final report. Allow me to focus a little bit on a dark shadow sort of that hung in his career. He resigned at some point after coming under investigations for alleged past human rights abuses, particularly his role in the 1984 Wagala massacre. Knowing the kind of person that he was, what do you think this did to him and his commitment to human rights?
Of course, as I said, with a man that had a long-standing career, successful career in diplomacy, and I must say, excellent diplomat. Of course, that dented him in a way, because some of the accusations, of course, that were out there were of a nature that threatened to bring down all that he had did over the years. That I must appreciate. But as again, the process was at the time, there are often processes and politics of processes. So as the questions of his involvement went on, there wasn't really a process that would have enabled him to explain whether or not he had a direct role in the process at the time. And of course, what would have happened also is that an individual named in that manner would have stepped down. But again, every person is entitled to a defense, and to if you claim they're directly involved, there should be evidence of that direct involvement. The reason that Ambassador was said to have been involved was that he was at the time a permanent secretary, and that he had visited Wagala shortly after the operations. I think that's what was in issue at the time. But as I've said, the TJRC process, of course, was mired in a lot of controversy at the time, because not all interest groups were interested in having the process, as had been contemplated, set out, because we had two groups and then eventually we had one group. So I know that is the reality. But in the end, in spite of all the questions that then were raised, we ended up working well, and we had a credible report that is out there for Kenyans to read and to consider. And as I've said, a lot of the recommendations have been recommended by various government departments. They've been implemented by various government departments.
All right, sir. All right, Professor. Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning on the passing on of former TJRC Commissioner Ambassador Bethuel Kiplagat. We do know that his body has now been moved to the Lee Funeral Home. For those of you who knew him, you do know that he was a commissioner at the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. He's passed on at the age of 80 at a Nairobi hospital after what we do know is a long illness. He also resigned after coming under investigation for alleged past human rights to do with the Wagala massacre, and he served as Kenya's special envoy to Somali peace process from 2003 to 2005, and he also headed the board of the African Medical and Research Foundation from 1991 to 2003. Like I mentioned, his body has now been taken to the Lee Funeral Home.